our final presentation in the theatre today is from Defence Export Control and is delivered by Komal, who just asked the question, which was fantastic. Komal will be discussing, sensitive technologies, and I'd like you to please welcome him to the podium. Thank you very much.
Good everyone. My name's Komal Sidhu. I'm from the Defence Export Control Branch. The printout, the program mentions Dr. Darren March, who's a colleague, and he couldn't be here, so I'm filling in. Pretty much everything that Brad mentioned has a segue into every single slide that I'm going to present, so it's perfect. I'm glad I'm following that presentation. Right. So what I'll do is I'll start with some of the very basic awareness-related stuff in terms of sensitive technologies, and then I'll link it to export controls, and we'll finish up with that. Right. So this is not rocket science, and we're all aware that the defence industry policy of 2016 encourages defence to actively engage with industry and DST and academia to develop next generation technologies for defence and to develop sovereign capabilities for Australia. Some of the bodies listed on the slide are involved in that process. But the thing is, from a regulator's perspective, from a defence export controls perspective, and from an intelligence perspective, it's important to be aware that Dr. Zielinski mentioned that defence is doing business, or DST is doing business, but from my perspective, we're adding vulnerabilities, and we're just adding to the threats that are there to our sensitive technologies, because that's my job, to be aware of that. Each sector is obviously vulnerable in its own way, and I'll talk about some of those sensitive technologies now. The reason why the threats are increasing is because obviously it's not rocket science. Again, we're involved in a global economy. No research is done totally in-house. Everything is collaboration with partner nations. It's done over the cloud. It's done electronically, and threats are posed through intentional or unintentional ways in that collaboration. So, what is a sensitive technology? How do we define it? There's two perspectives of looking at it. So there's the industry and the academia perspective, and so it's anything that is Australian developed, and it could be a military technology or a dual use technology, but anything that could be exploited or acquired by our enemies or just opportunists, we consider that as a sensitive technology. It could result in, obviously, as it says on the slide, result in anything that results in loss of money or IP, future business opportunities with the ADF that would be classified as a sensitive technology, Australian developed. From a defence perspective, it's slightly different. So defence sensitive technologies are anything to do with an ADF capability effect, anything that has a combat effectiveness effect, anything that is just takes away from our technological advantage is considered as sensitive technology. To be a bit more precise, these are some of the areas of interest that we look at, and the list on the slide it largely mirrors the next gen technology fund. I mean, that's been developed for a reason, and that has given us the need to look at that, because that is potentially an area of interest for our enemies as well. So some of the EW stuff, radar, directed energy weapons, some of the tech pitches you heard this morning, all that it's an area of interest for us. The challenge is to identify specific technologies when they go from basic scientific research to actual actual deployable capabilities. That's the challenge, to identify those technologies and then to concentrate on those and to work the systems or the risk mitigations to prevent it being exploited. So it's in this awareness session also, I mean, my job is also to ask for scientists and DSD's help in helping us identify those technologies where we might have a technological edge and our enemies might be looking to exploit that. Some of the threats and protections for a sensitive technology, the ones that are listed on the previous slide. I mean, this basically says that everything from basic research, TRL1, all the way up to when it's ready to be deployed or an actual product, the threats there. Some of the threats you might be aware, or at least us in the intelligence community, we're definitely aware. Academic solicitation, so employing ex-students or researchers and actually sending researchers or students to work for our companies, our industry, DSTG, seeking employment, obviously I mentioned that, and acquisition and directly foreign ownership, visits, symposia like these, it's risky business. Some cyber attacks is a pretty obvious one, but some of the more covert activities happen on a daily basis. The protections that we can put in place are raising awareness so that the researchers or people involved can protect themselves and in turn Australia. Putting in smart contracts, the physical security, so investing in our infrastructure, cybersecurity is an obvious one. Personnel security, so vetting of personnel, export controls, that's where we come in, and again, material protection and foreign investment reviews and the like. Without sounding too dramatic, I mean, the threat is real. This link, I'm sure the web and the presentations would be available later, so you can get that link then. But it's an interesting read on by the US, how they've been attacked, which industries, which technological areas have been attacked, and the methods used. It's quite an interesting read. So why are we talking about that? So I'm in the export control space. So what's happened is that defense is worried about this, to put it like that. We've been put in charge of a 2-star level advisory group called the Sensitive Technologies Advisory Group, STAG. It's a 2-star band 2 level advisory group looking at all the sensitive technologies, looking at everything that comes from the Next Gen Tech Fund to provide oversight, and then also look at risk mitigation strategies so that we can protect ourselves against those threats. So the Defence Export Control branch acts as the secretariat for that advisory group, and then we're actively involved with industry and academia in that space. The idea is to get involved early for us to develop visibility from a very early stage so we can work with people working in this space to develop those risk mitigation strategies. From an export control perspective, if you have been involved with the process in exporting something of a sensitive technology or a defense technology, no change as a result of the STAG or the advisory group. We still do everything on a case-by-case basis, and we still look at sensitive technologies from a risk perspective. A bit about the process that we follow when analyzing an export application is that we go through a technical assessment process and then a risk assessment process. Technical assessment is basically a check against the Defence's strategic goods list, which is legislation, which is our export control mechanism through the Customs Act. And we look at the list to identify or check, verify whether a technology or a piece of equipment or software or data could be controlled. It might be a sensitive technology, but it has to be on the DSGL. Then we do a risk assessment, which is a thorough process, and we go through some of those elements, but in essentially 12 elements that are listed in the Customs Act in Regulation 13E. And obviously there's anything that affects Australia's technological advantage or military capability gets looked at very closely. So what is regulated? If you have read the DSGL, you would be aware, but if you haven't, it's freely available on its legislation, so you can just go on legislation.government.au, look for the DSGL, it'll come up, and what it has two parts. Part one is a munitions list covering military items. Part two is a dual use list covering anything that could have a military utility and also a legitimate commercial use as well. But anything that is on the DSGL requires a permit from us for it to be exported. And that could include publishing of data or supply or the standard export. Now, part one is pretty obvious. Because of its military use, it's easy to identify items. It's unmanned ground vehicles, standard ground vehicles, military aircraft, explosives, arms and ammunition, and those sorts of things, chemical, biological agents that have WMD capability. All those, they reside within part one. Part two is more detailed, and it goes into various categories. The 9 categories are listed, and what happens is it breaks it down to spec level sometimes. So it narrows it down to encryption capabilities and whether it has a certain frequency or similar examples like that. Radios, as an example, would be in telecommunications equipment, and it goes down to the level of the encryption key length. So whether it's controlled or not controlled, it really goes down to a very detailed spec level. Another example of dual use is anything that could be used on an A330, for example, legitimate civilian use on a civilian aircraft. But the RAF KC-30 is a military aircraft, and the systems are quite common, so it's controlled in a way that, because that's a clear example of a dual use item. Okay, so when doing a technical assessment, if you are working in a sensitive technology or a controlled technology space, it really helps when if someone checks the DSGL first, they do a self-assessment. When putting in an application, they provide the technical specifications, etc. With that application, they list the applications of that technology or a piece of equipment to help us expedite the process, and also whether it's designed specifically for military use or not, that really helps. And then sometimes systems that are part of a larger system that could be controlled, that assessment helps as well. And obviously the development level of a technology. All those details go miles in helping us do an assessment quickly and helping the customer, the applicant. Okay, so a regulator always ends with some compliance-related information. So when we do take a graduated approach to compliance, it is everyone's responsibility. I mean, we had a company representative a couple of weeks ago come and have a robust conversation, as I put it, with us, basically having a go, saying, why is it taking this long? And your DSGL, what have you got in the DSGL? It's not our DSGL. We're just the regulator. It's legislation, so it's everyone's list pretty much. So for organizations, we always suggest having an internal export compliance program. That really helps, having knowing your responsibilities and then having a coordinated approach to export control within that organization does wonders and provides helps avoid problems later. If there is a mistake, and from time to time we do see mistakes where technology has been uploaded or shared or supplied / exported, and notify us, and then it could provide us with information that we can take a different approach rather than taking a strict compliance criminal investigation prosecution approach. I mentioned the graduated approach. We work with companies, and if there is a mistake, or if there's a trend of mistakes, obviously it's pretty obvious that gets flagged, and then we do we take a stricter approach to permits, and it just takes longer. So the compliance with the DSGL and export control obligations, it's everyone's responsibility, and it is in our national interest to do that, and also in personal interest to avoid prosecution. Okay, so almost done. All the resources, our website, I consider it to be a good website, and plenty of resources there. Do check it out. There's a self-paced training, plenty of resources, plenty of information, and there's a DSGL self-assessment tool as well. So if you like to use that, that's the way to go as well. The PDF is obviously downloadable from the legislation, government legislation website. Our website, it's on the slide. The email. Send us any questions, any queries that you may have. Call the number. We also do in-principle assessments. We provide informal advice. We sit within the industry policy division, so it's imperative that we support industry in making achieving our export ambitions. But we're also there so that we are in compliance with non-proliferation obligations that we have, because we're a signatory to a bunch of international agreements, and to prevent proliferation of arms and weapons of mass destruction. We're there as the gatekeeper, but we are there to enable industry to do those exports. Any questions?
I'll actually reverse the favour. As you'd realised from my presentation before, we're very familiar with export controls and that sort of things. We also have internal to our company, we have what we call our responsible trading policy, which asks the question at every step: are the customers that we're looking at suitable to sell to? One of the dilemmas we often get into is whether or not there's going to be any on-selling of our capability. Is there anything you've got in that controls the on-selling? Because it's one thing to look at who we want to export to. What about the follow-on from that?
Without going into too much detail, we consult heavily with our intelligence network and the Five Eyes intelligence network. So we rely heavily on that, and we deny exports on a weekly basis, and that's all part of a database of information and experts and all the knowledge that the Five Eyes countries and our intelligence network has to make sure that we prevent that from happening. But it does happen from time to time, and it's always every single occurrence we feed it into our risk assessment process, and then every day we try and make it harder for people to do that. But we also come across cases where we get surprised, and then we just act on that.
All right, just a quick question. How much input does your office have into refining the Australian and US trade treaty agreement, so that obviously to assist Australian industry and get Australian industries assisting US industry, so the reverse way? How often are you looking at that? And can we expect a new iteration of the agreement to encompass more products or make the process a bit more streamlined in the future?
We've got a lot of involvement with the US, obviously, and it happens on a regular basis. To answer your question, we're always looking at that, and it's a gradual process, but we do work with them very closely. I had a comment earlier this morning. I was talking to someone and they said that the DSGL is state of the art from 1996, and I couldn't argue the point, but my counter argument is that the DSGL largely mirrors what's in other countries as well, so it's not very Australian unique, even though it is Australian unique. We're part of international agreements, the Wassenaar arrangement, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, Australia Group, and all these arrangements and regimes are there to make sure that sensitive technologies are controlled and to prevent the proliferation of those. So yes, it can come across as outdated, but it is a collective effort of 40 to 45 countries. So it does, like anything very international and global at that scale, it does sort of lag behind technological advances. Thank you.
As a token of our appreciation for your time today and that really interesting presentation, please join me in thanking Komal again. Thank you.
Thank you.